Three men had made her a promise. Three men stood in the street and looked at her like she was something they'd ordered by mistake. The one called Hargrove, broad-shouldered, red-faced, smelling of livestock and last night's whiskey, didn't even let her speak. He looked her over the way a man looks at a horse he's decided isn't worth the stable fee. "Circumstances changed," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Not quiet, not private, loud. Like he wanted witnesses, like he needed the town of Blackridge to know he had standards. The second man, a thin-fingered farmer named Betts, had the decency to look at his boots while he said it. "I was expecting someone different." Different. That word landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples went everywhere. The third one, she never even learned his name afterward, just shook his head and walked away without a word. Evelyn Carter stood in the middle of a street she'd never seen before, in a town she didn't know, holding a suitcase that contained everything she owned in the world. 43 years old, alone. And every soul in Blackridge watching like it was the most interesting thing that had happened since the last rainfall. If you've ever been humiliated in front of strangers, you know what that moment costs you. Not just pride. Something deeper. Something harder to name. Stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's story to the very end. Because what happens next will change what you believe about starting over. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me your city and country, and let's see how far this story travels. The stagecoach that carried Evelyn Carter into Blackridge arrived 11 minutes late, which she would later think about more than she probably should have. 11 minutes. She used to believe in signs like that. By the time the wheels finally stopped grinding against the packed dirt of Main Street, she had straightened her collar 3 times, smoothed her skirt twice, and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 6 weeks. You survived the city. You can survive this. She was not a young woman in the way that frontiermen seemed to picture when they wrote their advertisements in the back pages of Eastern papers. She had lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting against sun through factory windows. Her hands were rough from laundry work and cleaning other people's homes. She was solid, not delicate. Practical, not ornamental. She had believed, reading those 3 letters over and over in her small rented room in Philadelphia, that practical was exactly what frontiermen needed. She had been wrong about what they needed. Or rather, she had been wrong about what they thought they wanted. The town of Blackridge was not what the letters had described either. Every man who had written to her had painted it in somewhat different colors, but they'd all made it sound like a place with possibility. What she saw stepping off that coach was a main street of maybe 14 buildings, a water trough that needed repair, a general store with a sagging awning, and dust. Dust on everything. Dust in the air, on the storefronts, on the faces of the people who'd stopped their errands to watch the stagecoach arrive. That was the first thing she noticed. How many people had stopped to watch? That should have told her something. Hargrove was the biggest of the 3, so she saw him first. He was standing slightly ahead of the other 2, arms crossed over his chest, hat pushed back on his forehead. He had the look of a man who was used to being looked at and didn't mind it. The other 2 stood slightly behind him, Betts with his hat in his hands, working the brim with his fingers, and the third man whose name she never got, standing very still with an expression she couldn't read from a distance. Evelyn climbed down from the coach without help. The driver handed her suitcase down and she took it, and she walked toward the 3 men with her chin level and her back straight, because that was the only way she knew how to walk toward anything. She got within 6 feet of Hargrove before his face changed. It wasn't dramatic. That was almost the worst part. It wasn't a flinch or a grimace. It was something quieter and more damaging. A slow recalibration, like a man adjusting an estimate downward. His eyes moved from her face to her hands to her dress and back to her face, and somewhere in that brief circuit, something was decided. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hargrove." She stopped. She waited. He uncrossed his arms. He glanced sideways at the 2 men behind him, then back at her, and he said, "I'm afraid my circumstances have changed since I wrote to you." The words were so ordinary, so casual, as if he were explaining a change in weather. "Changed," she repeated. That's right. He didn't elaborate. He didn't apologize. He just stood there in the street, large and certain of himself, and let the sentence sit between them like something he'd set down and wasn't planning to pick up again. Evelyn turned to look at Betts. I was already shaking his head before she said a word, already looking at his boots in that particular way. Men look at things they don't want to face. "I was expecting someone different," he said, and she heard what lived inside that word: younger, softer, smaller, something that would bend more easily into the shape of whatever he'd imagined. The third man walked away without speaking. For a moment, just a moment, Evelyn stood very still and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. She was aware of the street, of the people watching, of the way sound seemed to flatten and recede, like the world was giving her a small, terrible privacy to absorb this. She felt the handle of her suitcase in her palm. She felt the dust in her throat. She felt the specific corrosive burn of being evaluated and found wanting in front of witnesses who would remember it. Then she picked up her suitcase a little more firmly and walked to the hotel. She did not look back. Inside, the hotel was dim and smelled of tobacco and old wood. A woman behind the desk, mid-50s, gray-streaked hair pulled tight, expression professionally neutral, looked up as Evelyn came in. "Need a room," Evelyn said. "$1 a night." "I'll take one night." She set the dollar on the counter and accepted the key without another word. The woman watched her with the careful attention of someone who had seen the stagecoach arrive and already knew most of what there was to know. The room was small. A bed with a thin quilt, a washstand with a cracked basin, a single window that looked out over the alley beside the building. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and set her suitcase on the floor in front of her, and she did the arithmetic she'd been putting off since Hargrove opened his mouth. She had $11.40. She had a return ticket to Philadelphia that would cost her $7 of those dollars, which she had brought with her specifically for this possibility. Because she was not a foolish woman, whatever else she was. That left $4.40 to get her to the next eastbound coach, which she did not know the schedule of, and to feed herself in the meantime. She could go back. That was the honest calculation. She could go back to Philadelphia and the rented room and the laundry work and the grinding sameness of a life that had been narrowing for years. She could do that. It was a real option. She sat with that option for a while, turning it over, looking at its edges. Then she went downstairs and asked the woman at the desk where she might find work. The woman, her name turned out to be Ruth, and she volunteered this without being asked, which Evelyn took as a small sign of something, looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not a lot going right now," Ruth said carefully. "Harvest's done. Most of the ranches are laid up for winter work, not taking on help." A pause. "You could try the laundry on Pine, and there's a family on the edge of town looking for someone to help with their children, but..." Another pause. This one weighted differently. "But what?" Evelyn asked. "The wife is difficult," Ruth said, with the tone of a woman who had already said more than she intended and was declining to go further. Evelyn thanked her and went back upstairs. She did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual for her. She had not slept well in years, had not slept well since the factory accident that took 2 fingers from her left hand, and with them the steady work she'd counted on, had not slept well since the small, slow catastrophes that had accumulated into the life she was currently trying to leave behind. But that night was particularly bad. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of an unfamiliar town settling into dark. A dog somewhere. Voices from what she assumed was a saloon, the creak of the building's old timber. And she thought about Hargrove's face when he looked at her. The recalibration. The downward adjustment. She was not naive about what men looked for in the advertisements they placed. She knew that youth was currency out here, the same as everywhere. She knew that her roughened hands and her squared jaw and her 43 years were not what any of them had pictured when they wrote their careful letters about ranching and partnership and building something together. She had known this risk when she answered those letters. She had answered them anyway, because the alternative, staying exactly where she was, watching the walls of her life grow slowly closer, felt worse than any possible humiliation the frontier could offer. She had underestimated the humiliation. Around midnight, she got up and sat in the chair by the window. The alley below was quiet. There was a strip of sky visible between the hotel and the building across from it, and she looked at it for a while, not thinking anything in particular, just sitting with it. This was something she had always been able to do, just sit with difficulty, without immediately trying to make it into something she could solve or escape. Her mother had called it stubbornness. Her father had called it patience. She was not sure which it was. Maybe neither. Maybe it was just a particular form of endurance that looked like stillness from the outside. The letter arrived the following morning. She was eating breakfast in the hotel's small dining room, eggs and bread, which cost 20 cents and was better than she expected. When Ruth brought it in and set it on the table beside her plate without comment, Evelyn looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a plain, unornamented hand. No return address. She opened it. Miss Carter, I saw what happened yesterday. I was not going to write this letter, but I have been talking myself out of it since last evening, and I have not managed to do so. My name is Caleb Thornton. I run a cattle operation about 6 miles north of Blackridge. I am not writing to propose marriage. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because I suspect the last thing you need right now is another man making you promises he has no intention of keeping. What I am offering is work. I have 2 children, a daughter, Maggie, who is 9, and a son, Noah, who is 12. Their mother died 14 months ago. My house is not in good order. I am a man who understands cattle and fencing and weather, and I do not understand how to run a household or how to help children grieve, and I will not pretend otherwise. The work would be hard. I cannot pay much, but I can offer a room, meals, and honest treatment. If the arrangement does not suit either of us, you would be free to leave at any time, with whatever wages you have earned and your dignity fully intact. I will be at the hotel until midday if you want to discuss this. If you have already left Blackridge on this morning's coach, I understand completely. Caleb Thornton. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she set it down beside her coffee cup and looked at it while she finished her eggs. There were things in that letter that could be traps. She was experienced enough to know this. A man who says, I am not proposing marriage in the first paragraph might simply be a man who intends to wait and see how dependent you become before he starts adjusting the terms. A man who says, I understand cattle and not children, might simply be a man who wants a woman to raise his children for free and has found a cleaner way to ask for it. She had met men like that in Philadelphia. She had very nearly married one. But there were also things in the letter that were simply specific. The information was specific. The children's names and ages, the 14 months, the honest accounting of what he didn't know how to do. In her experience, men who were running a particular kind of scheme tended toward vagueness. Vagueness gave them room. Specificity was a kind of exposure. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went looking for Caleb Thornton. She found him outside, leaning against the post in front of the general store with a coffee cup in his hand, watching the street with the unhurried attention of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had learned not to be in a hurry. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the weathered look of someone who lived by what the sky decided. He was not a handsome man in any easy sense. His face was too angular for that, his jaw too sharp, his eyes a little too direct. But he looked like someone who told the truth even when it was inconvenient, and right now that was worth more to Evelyn than handsome. He saw her coming and straightened slightly, not in a courtly way, just the natural adjustment of a person who had been leaning and was now paying attention. Mr. Thornton, she said. Miss Carter. He did not offer his hand. He did not look her over the way Hargrove had. He looked at her face and waited. You saw what happened, she said. It was not quite a question. I did. And you felt sorry for me. He considered that for a moment. I felt angry on your behalf, he said. Hargrove is a man who enjoys an audience. I felt that was an ugly thing to do in a public street. But you waited until morning to write. I needed to think about whether I was offering something real or just trying to make myself feel better about what I'd watched. He said this plainly, like it was just information. I decided it was real. Evelyn put her hand in her pocket and touched the folded letter. You said your house is not in good order. What does that mean specifically? He told her. Specifically. The kitchen was functional, but the stores were disorganized. The laundry had been done inconsistently for over a year. The garden had gone to weeds since June. The children ate adequately but without routine, which he believed was contributing to Noah's anger and Maggie's withdrawal. He said all of this with the same tone he might use to describe a fence that needed mending. Not ashamed of it exactly, but not defensive either. Just honest about the state of things. What happened to your wife? Evelyn asked. A pause. The first pause that felt like it cost him something. Fever, he said. It came fast. She was sick 4 days and then she was gone. Another pause. Maggie was with her at the end. She has not talked about it since. And Noah? Noah was in the barn when it happened. He did not get to say goodbye. He looked at his coffee cup. He has not forgiven himself for that. Evelyn stood in the dust of Black Ridge's main street and looked at this man who had just told her the most painful thing about his family in the second minute of their conversation, and she thought, well, at least he doesn't waste time. My conditions, she said. He nodded. I will not be treated as a servant. I will manage the household as I see fit, and if I have a different approach than what you're used to, I expect to be heard rather than overruled. I will not replace their mother, and no one should ask me to, either explicitly or by expectation. If I see the arrangement is not working, for them, for you, or for me, I will say so directly and leave without drama. Those are reasonable conditions, he said, and I want it clear between us that this is employment, not an audition for anything else. He looked at her then with something that was close to amusement, but stopped short of it. Miss Carter, I have 2 grieving children and a cattle operation that is running me harder than I expected. I am not in any position to be thinking about anything else. He paused. I trust that's clear enough? It is, she said. They settled on a wage. It was modest but honest, and he named it first without asking her to negotiate, which she noted. He told her he had a wagon outside of town and would return in 3 hours. She told him she would be ready. She went upstairs, packed her suitcase. It took 8 minutes. She had so little, paid for a second night she wouldn't use, and left the remainder of the room money with Ruth, who took it without making a production of it. Thornton Ranch? Ruth asked. Yes. Ruth looked at her for a moment. He's a decent man, stubborn, but decent. She paused. The boy is going to be hard. I know, Evelyn said, though she didn't, not yet, not really. The wagon ride was mostly silent. Caleb drove and Evelyn sat beside him, and they watched the land open up around them. The flat scrub giving way gradually to rolling range, the sky enormous and pale in the way that sky only got in certain open places. She had never been this far west. It was bigger than she'd expected, the land, more indifferent. It did not care whether she made something of herself out here or not. She found that oddly restful. They were perhaps too much. When Caleb said, without preamble, Maggie will probably try to like you immediately. Don't let her. She does that with every woman who comes near the house because she's desperate for... He stopped, started again. She needs something she can count on, not someone who's going to be kind to her for a week and then leave. So don't let her attach until you know whether this is actually going to work. Evelyn looked at him. You're asking me not to be warm to your daughter. I'm asking you not to let her think you're permanent until you know if you are. He kept his eyes on the road. She's had enough people not stay. It was the most words he had said together, and underneath them was something that had nothing to do with Maggie's attachment patterns. Evelyn chose not to point this out. And the boy? She asked. Noah will tell you he doesn't need anything from you. That will be true right up until it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to help him. I've tried. He hears me like I'm someone who's also to blame for what happened, and maybe he's right. You weren't to blame. No, he said. But I was the one who went to Abilene that week to sell cattle, and she got sick while I was gone. He said it like someone who had turned a stone over many times and found the same thing under it every time and had not figured out what to do with that thing. I got back in time. Just. But Noah knew I was gone when it started, and he stopped. He's 12. He needs someone to be angry at. And you let him be angry at you. What else am I going to do? Evelyn did not answer, because she didn't have an answer that was good enough yet. She looked out at the range and thought about a 12-year-old boy alone in a barn while his mother died in the house, and about what that did to a person, and about whether it was the kind of damage that ever fully repaired, or whether it was the kind that just became part of the structure over time. The ranch came into view around a slow bend. A main house, a barn larger than the house, 2 outbuildings in varying states of repair, and a fence line that stretched farther than she could see. It was not what anyone would call beautiful. It was functional, and it had been functional for a long time, and somewhere along the last 14 months, the ordinary maintenance of a lived-in place had started to slide. She could see it in the way the porch listed slightly to the left, in the kitchen garden that had gone mostly to dry stalks and something that had been squash once, in the curtains visible through the front window that hung crooked on their rod, and had probably hung that way for months without anyone noticing or having the energy to care. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. And before he could come around to offer a hand, she had already climbed down herself and was standing with her suitcase, looking at the front door. The door opened. Maggie was 9 and small for it, with her father's sharp jaw softened into something more tentative, and dark eyes that were doing exactly what Caleb had warned her about, opening wide with a particular kind of hope that was almost painful to look at directly. She was wearing a dress that had been mended twice at the hem, and her hair was braided but not well, one side tighter than the other in the way of a child who had learned to do it herself because no one else had time. She came to the edge of the porch and stopped. "This is Miss Carter," Caleb said. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping out around the house." Maggie looked at Evelyn with those wide, careful eyes. "Hello," she said, in a voice that was working very hard not to want things. "Hello, Maggie," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even, warm, but not effusive. She did not smile too broadly or crouch down to the child's level in that particular way adults did when they were performing gentleness rather than feeling it. She just looked at her steadily, the way you'd look at someone you intended to be honest with. Something in Maggie's face shifted, very slightly, in a direction that was harder to read. Not disappointment, something more complicated. Noah was not on this porch. Noah, as it turned out, was in the barn. Caleb said he would let the boy come in on his own, and Evelyn said that was fine. She carried her suitcase inside and looked at the house, really looked at it, the way you looked at a problem you were planning to solve. Not critically, not with despair, but with a clear and useful inventory of what was actually there. The main room had a table with 4 chairs, a fireplace that needed cleaning, a floor that had been swept recently but not well, and a smell that was not bad exactly, but was the particular smell of a place that had been holding its breath for a long time. The kitchen was through a narrow doorway, a cast-iron stove in better condition than she expected, a dry sink, shelves that were stocked but chaotically, jars in no order, flour and cornmeal and salt and things she couldn't immediately identify, all jumbled together by someone who had been prioritizing survival over system. She set her suitcase down by the table. "Your room is through there," Caleb said, nodding toward a door off the kitchen. "It was a storage room, but I cleared it out and put a bed in." She looked at the door. "When did you do that?" "This morning, after I sent the letter." She looked at him. "I wasn't certain you'd come," he said, "but I thought I should be ready in case you did." She went and looked at the room. It was small, not much larger than a closet, honestly, with a single iron bed and a window that looked out at the side yard and the fence line. The bed had a quilt on it, folded with the particular imprecision of a man who had made beds without being taught how. There was a nail on the wall for hanging things. It was the smallest room she had ever agreed to sleep in. It was also somehow the first room in years that felt like hers. She set her suitcase on the bed and turned around, and Caleb was in the doorway looking a little uncertain for the first time. Not uncertain about whether he'd done the right thing, she thought, but uncertain about whether she thought he had. "It'll do," she said. He nodded. Something in his shoulders settled, almost imperceptibly. "Supper's usually around 6. There's not much in the house right now. I'll handle supper," she said. "Go back to your work." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, and then he went. She listened to his boots on the floor, and then the door, and then the crunch of the yard outside, and she stood alone in her small room and breathed. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the nail, rolled up her sleeves, and went to find out what was actually in the kitchen. Maggie appeared in the kitchen doorway about 20 minutes later, while Evelyn was reorganizing the shelves. The child didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching. Evelyn kept working. She moved the flour to the left side, the cornmeal beside it, pulled out 3 jars of something that had gone bad and set them aside, found a tin of lard that had been pushed to the back and brought it forward. She could feel Maggie watching every movement with that particular intensity of a child who is deciding something. "The beans are behind the cornmeal," Maggie said finally. Evelyn moved the cornmeal and found the beans. "Thank you." A pause. "Ma always kept them on the right side." "Where would you like them?" Evelyn asked. Maggie blinked. This was apparently not the response she had expected. Wherever," she said. "Doesn't matter." "It does matter," Evelyn said. "You live here. I'm just organizing. Tell me where things should be and I'll put them there." Maggie came slowly into the kitchen. She was barefoot, which on a November day was a small alarm, but not the alarm to address right now. She stood beside Evelyn and looked at the shelves with surprising seriousness. Ma kept the beans on the right, she said, and the salt at eye level so she could reach it fast. Then that's where they'll be, Evelyn said. She moved them. Maggie watched this happen with an expression Evelyn recognized because she had worn it herself at various points in her life. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a small and specific thing to be understood and has stopped expecting that it will be. "What are you making for supper?" Maggie asked. "I'm not sure yet. What is your father like?" "He doesn't care. He'll eat anything." A pause. "Noah likes cornbread." "Then I'll make cornbread." Maggie looked at her. "He won't say thank you." "I'm not making it for thank you," Evelyn said. "I'm making it because you told me he likes it." This appeared to require some processing. Maggie stood very still for a moment, and then she moved to the other side of the kitchen and sat on the low stool beside the stove and watched. And she didn't say anything else for a long time, but she didn't leave either. Noah came in at 10 minutes to 6. He came through the back door, not the front, which meant he had been watching from somewhere and timed it so he wouldn't have to pass Evelyn to get inside. He was tall for 12, all angles and barely contained motion, and he had his father's jaw and his father's direct eyes, and none of his father's hard-won stillness. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. She was standing at the stove. She did not turn around. "Supper's ready in 10 minutes, she said to the wall in front of her. She heard him go still. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was on the edge of something. Not quite hostile, not quite not. "Pa told us." "All right. You don't have to make cornbread. Your sister told me you like it." A pause. "Maggie talks too much." "She talks an appropriate amount," Evelyn said, still not turning. "Wash your hands, please. Supper in 10 minutes. She heard the scrape of a chair. She heard water being poured. She heard the particular silence of a 12-year-old boy who has been answered in a way that didn't give him anything to push against, and who is now working out what to do about that. She kept her eyes on the stove. Caleb came in at 6. He washed at the basin by the door, sat at the table, and looked at the supper Evelyn had assembled from what was in the kitchen. A bean soup that was better than anyone might have expected from those supplies. Cornbread, cold cuts of something from a wrapped package at the back of the icebox. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had resigned himself to not having. He didn't say anything. He just sat and waited, and when Maggie climbed into her chair and Noah took his seat, not looking at Evelyn, his jaw set in that particular way, Caleb said, "Miss Carter, will you sit with us?" She had been about to stay in the kitchen. She looked at him. "There are 4 chairs," he said. "No reason you should stand." She carried her bowl to the table and sat in the 4th chair, the one on the far end opposite Caleb, with the children between them. Noah did not look at her. Maggie glanced at her sideways with those careful eyes. They ate. It was not comfortable. No one pretended it was comfortable. The soup was eaten, and the cornbread, and the cold cuts, and Caleb had 2 bowls of soup without saying so was his intent, and Noah ate 3 pieces of cornbread and acknowledged none of them. After supper, Caleb said, "That was the best meal this table has had in I don't know how long." He said it simply, without making a performance of it. A fact. Noah pushed his chair back and carried his plate to the kitchen and set it in the basin and went upstairs without a word. Maggie looked after him, then back at Evelyn. "He liked the cornbread," she said in a small, careful voice. "I know," Evelyn said. She stayed up after the children went to bed, cleaning the kitchen properly, banking the fire for the night, going through the rest of the supplies and making a list of what was needed. Caleb sat at the table for a while, not bothering her, doing something with a ledger. They were in the same room without speaking, and it was not awkward. It was the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have decided to be honest with each other and don't feel the need to fill every silence with proof of it. Around 9, he closed the ledger and stood. "I'll be up at 4, he said. "The cattle don't wait." "I'll have coffee ready," she said. He stopped at the doorway. "Miss Carter." He paused. "What those men did today, in the street, is over," she said, without looking up from her list. "I'm not carrying it in here with me." Another pause. "All right," he said. "Good night." "Good night, Mr. Thornton." She listened to his footsteps on the stairs. She looked at her list. She added 3 items she had forgotten. Outside, the wind had picked up. That particular night wind that came off the range and pressed against the windows like something testing for a way in. The fire clicked and settled. Evelyn Carter sat alone in the kitchen of a broken house in the middle of a country that didn't know her yet, and she made her list, and she was not afraid. She had been afraid on the stagecoach, and afraid in the hotel room, and afraid standing in the street with her suitcase while the town watched. She had been afraid most of her life, one way or another. But fear and stopping were two different things. She had always known that. It was maybe the only thing she had always known. She finished her list, folded it, and put it in her pocket, and went to her small room with its iron bed and its crooked quilt, and for the first time in a long time, she slept. The coffee was ready at 4, as she had promised. She heard Caleb on the stairs before she saw him, the particular sound of a man who had learned to move quietly in a sleeping house, each step placed with care. He came through the kitchen doorway already dressed, coat on, hat in his hand, and stopped when he saw the lamp lit and the coffee pot sitting on the stove and Evelyn at the table with her list from the night before. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "You didn't have to be up," he said. "I know," she said. "The list. I need to talk to you about supplies before you head out." He poured himself a cup and sat across from her and listened while she went through it. Flour was low. The salt pork was almost gone. There were enough beans for perhaps 10 days if she was careful, less if she wasn't. The children needed something more consistent than what had been passing for meals. Not because what Caleb had been doing was wrong, but because children steadied when their stomachs were on a schedule. And schedule required ingredients, and ingredients required a trip to town. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the list, not at her. "I can go to Blackridge on Thursday," he said. "I'll take you so you can pick what you need." "I can give you the list. You'll pick it better than I will." He drank his coffee. "I went to school with Hargrove," he said, without any particular lead-in. She looked at him. "I'm not saying that to explain him," he said quickly. "I'm saying it because you'll probably see him in town, and I thought you should know that I don't have any loyalty to that situation." "Understood," Evelyn said. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and stood. He pulled on his hat. "There's oats in the barn if the children want porridge. Maggie knows where the sugar is." He paused at the door. "Noah might not come down for breakfast. He does that sometimes. I'll leave a plate." He looked at her for a moment with that same expression she couldn't fully read. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than gratitude, something that had more uncertainty in it. Then he went out, and she heard the barn door, and the ranch went quiet again except for the wind and the low, steady sound of cattle somewhere in the distance. She did not leave Noah a plate. She left him a covered bowl of porridge with a folded cloth to keep it warm, and a piece of bread beside it, and she did not make a production of it or put it anywhere visible. She set it on the low shelf by the back stairs where it would be easy to take without being observed. She did not know if this was the right thing. She was not sure yet what the right things were with Noah. She only knew that 12-year-old boys who were angry and grieving did not, in her experience, respond well to being seen doing the things they needed. He took the bowl. She found it empty in the basin when she came back from the garden at mid-morning. The garden was worse than she had thought from the wagon. It was not just neglected. It had been neglected in the particular way that happened when a capable person was suddenly absent and the people left behind were surviving rather than tending. There were the dry stalks of what had been a respectable summer garden, but underneath them, in the places where the soil had held some moisture, things were still technically alive. Woody stems of sage, a rosemary plant that had gone leggy and desperate, 2 rows of something that might still be salvaged if the ground wasn't frozen yet, which it wasn't quite. She spent 2 hours in the garden, not trying to fix it. That was a spring project. That was a whole separate conversation with the soil, but clearing enough of the dead material to see what she was working with. Maggie came out around 9 and watched from the porch railing, feet hooked over the lower board, chin on her arms. "Ma planted that rosemary the year I was born," she said. Evelyn looked at the rosemary plant. "I know, it's still alive. Pa almost pulled it up in August. He thought it was dead." "It wasn't dead. It just looked like it." She pruned back the worst of the dead wood with the small knife she'd found in the kitchen drawer. Sometimes things that look finished are just waiting. Maggie was quiet for a while. Then, "Do you know about plants?" "A little. My mother kept a garden." Where? Pennsylvania. Different soil than this, different water, but the basics are the same. Maggie climbed down from the railing and came to the edge of the garden. She stopped at the border, not quite coming in, as if the garden still belonged to someone else and required permission. She used to let me help, she said. She was understood. You can help me if you want to, Evelyn said. I could use someone who knows where things were planted. A long pause. Maggie looked at the rosemary, then at the dry stalks, then at Evelyn. The squash was in the middle row, she said. Ma said it needed the most sun. Good to know for spring, Evelyn said. Maggie came into the garden. She didn't say much after that, but she worked, pulling dead stalks and piling them as Evelyn directed. And the silence between them was the comfortable silence of people doing a task together, rather than the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know how to be near each other. Evelyn noticed, without commenting on it, that Maggie had put on shoes before coming outside. Progress of a small kind. Noah appeared at the edge of the barn around mid-morning. He stood there for a moment, and Evelyn could feel him watching without turning to look. Then she heard him go back in. The week settled into a rhythm the way weeks did when someone took deliberate hold of them. Evelyn was up at 4, coffee ready, list reviewed. Breakfast at 6:30, which meant that for the first time in over a year there was hot food on the table when Caleb came in from the early chores. Maggie appeared reliably. Noah appeared inconsistently, but he appeared, which she had been told was an improvement. She repaired the curtain rod on a Tuesday. It was a small thing, a bracket that had pulled loose from the wall, a matter of 10 minutes and the right nail. But she noticed Caleb looking at the straight-hanging curtains when he came in for lunch that day, and then looking at her, and then looking away with the particular expression of a man who is recalibrating something. She reorganized the barn tack room on a Wednesday, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had gone in looking for a tool and found it in a state that suggested it had last been organized by someone in a hurry, and disorganization in a working barn was a form of future emergency. Caleb came in while she was halfway through it and stopped in the doorway. You don't have to do the barn, he said. I know. She moved a coil of rope to the high hook where it belonged. I found a split in the harness trace, left side. You'll want to replace that before you use it. He came in and looked at the trace she had set aside. He ran his thumb along the split. Good catch, he said quietly. She went back to the tack room. He stayed and helped her finish, working in the same comfortable silence that she and Maggie had established in the garden, and she thought that it was a particular kind of family trait, the Thornton willingness to be present without explaining themselves. She was not sure yet whether this was a strength or a way of avoiding things, possibly both. The first real difficulty with Noah came on a Thursday. She had told him, that morning, that she needed the kindling box filled before supper. She had not made a request of it. She had simply stated it as one of the things that needed to happen, the same way she would have said the water barrel needed topping or the lamp needed trimming. A household had requirements. She was not singling him out. He did not fill the kindling box. She discovered this at 4:30 when she went to start supper and found the box empty. She did not say anything at dinner. She cooked supper with what wood was left in the bin beside the stove, and she served the meal, and she waited. After the plates were cleared, she looked at Noah across the table. The kindling box, she said. He looked back at her. His jaw was set. I forgot. All right, please do it now. A pause that lasted too long. It's dark. There's a lantern by the barn door. She stood and began clearing the remaining dishes. It's not a punishment. It's just kindling. He sat for another moment. She could feel him deciding whether to push, and then he scraped his chair back and took the lantern off the hook by the door and went outside. She heard him at the woodpile. She heard the particular rhythm of it. Not angry, not compliant, somewhere in between. Caleb was still at the table. He had not said anything during this exchange. He looked at her now with an expression she was beginning to learn, the expression of a man watching someone handle something he has been unable to handle, and feeling equal parts relief and something that was not quite shame, but was in the same neighborhood. You didn't let it go, he said. No. I usually... He stopped. I know, she said. And she did know, because she could see the shape of it. He let things go with Noah because not letting them go felt like adding to a weight the boy was already struggling under. It was a kindness with a bad long-term structure. Caleb looked at his coffee cup. He's going to push harder before he stops pushing. Probably, she said. That's fine. He glanced up at her. You're not worried about it. I've dealt with people who push, she said. The ones who push are usually the ones who are testing whether you're going to leave. She said it flatly, as information. If you hold steady, eventually they get an answer to the question they were actually asking. Caleb was quiet for a moment. And if you don't hold steady? Then they were right to test, she said. Noah came back in with the kindling box full, stomped the snow off his boots. There had been a light frost that evening, the first real one, and set the box down by the stove with more force than was necessary. He hung the lantern on its hook. He did not look at Evelyn. Thank you, she said. He went upstairs. Maggie, who had been sitting very still in the corner with a piece of mending she had not been doing much actual mending on, let out a small breath. She looked at Evelyn, and then at the stairs, and then back at her mending. He's not always like that, she said, in the careful voice she used when she was trying to protect someone she loved. I know, Evelyn said. He's working something out. Maggie pulled a stitch through her mending. He talks in his sleep sometimes, she said very quietly. I can hear him through the wall. He says her name. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She folded the dish towel she'd been holding and set it on the counter. That's grief, she said finally. It doesn't have a schedule. Maggie nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected but needed to hear from someone who sounded certain. The Thursday trip to Blackridge came and went with less incident than Evelyn had prepared herself for. She saw Hargrove outside the feed store as she and Caleb came out of the general store. He saw her too. He made a point of looking away first, which told her something about what kind of man he was. Not the kind who owned his behavior, but the kind who hoped his behavior would be forgotten if he didn't acknowledge it. She let him have that. She had no interest in a confrontation she had nothing to gain from. Betts was not in town. The third man, she still had not learned his name, apparently did not come into Blackridge often. Ruth, at the hotel, was watering the plants in the window box when Evelyn passed, and she looked up and said, Heard you went out to the Thornton place, in a tone that conveyed approximately 6 different things at once. That's right, Evelyn said. How are those children? Ruth asked. And the question was genuine. Evelyn could hear it, the particular sincerity of someone who had watched a family sustain a loss and had been worrying about them in the background. Getting there, Evelyn said. Ruth nodded, satisfied enough. She went back to her window box. At the feed store, Caleb ran into a neighboring rancher named Del Marsh, who had the manner of a man who had been making quiet social calculations before Caleb arrived and was ready to share his conclusions. He clapped Caleb on the shoulder and said he'd heard he had some help out at the ranch, said it with the particular weight that told you he'd been discussing this with other people, and then looked at Evelyn with open assessment. Miss Carter, Caleb said. She's managing the house. That's so, Del said. He looked at Evelyn. You're the one came in on the stage a couple weeks back. That's right, Evelyn said. Del made a small sound. Not quite approval, not quite judgment. Caleb could use the help, he said to Caleb, as if Evelyn had become briefly abstract. Lord knows that place has been running on nothing. It's been running, Caleb said. His voice stayed even, but something in it had gone flat. Evelyn did not say anything. She noted the way Caleb had answered, not defensive, but not accepting either, a man who would not have his difficulty spoken of as failure in front of a stranger. She noted it and filed it. On the ride back, with the wagon loaded and the afternoon going gray around them, Caleb said, Del's not a bad man. No, she agreed. He just talks. Most people do. Caleb held the reins in his left hand and rubbed the back of his neck with his right. People will talk about you, he said. Being out here, the situation. I know. It doesn't... I want you to know that I'm aware of that, and I'm not going to... I don't expect you to... He stopped. He was not a man who ran out of words often, and running out of them seemed to frustrate him. I mean, I intend to be clear to anyone who asks what your role is and that it's an honorable one. Evelyn looked at him. Mr. Thornton, people said what they were going to say about me the day I stepped off that stagecoach. Whatever they say about me now is better than what they said then, so I'm not too concerned about it. He looked at her sideways. That's a particular way to look at it. It's the accurate one, she said. He almost smiled. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, the thing that thought about becoming a smile and then reconsidered. She looked back at the road. 3 weeks into her time at the Thornton Ranch, something began to shift with Maggie. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that only became visible in retrospect, when you could look back and see the precise point where one thing had quietly become something else. Maggie began coming to the kitchen in the morning, not just for breakfast, but a little before it, standing in the doorway in her nightgown watching Evelyn work. She began asking questions, not many and not personal ones, but the kind of questions that meant she was paying attention. Why did you put the salt in before the water boiled? Why do you let the bread cool before you cut it? What does it mean when the fire smells like that? Evelyn answered every question directly, without making it a lesson. She treated Maggie's curiosity as a thing that deserved honest information, not performance. One morning, she turned from the stove and found Maggie beside her, not in the doorway, but beside her, close enough to see into the pan. She had not asked permission, she had just moved. "Stir this," Evelyn said, and handed her the spoon. Maggie stirred. They stood side by side in the kitchen while the light came up outside and the porridge moved in slow circles, and Maggie stirred with complete concentration, as if she had been given a task that mattered, which, Evelyn supposed, she had. Noah found them like that when he came down for breakfast. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them, and something went across his face that was too fast to catch and too complicated to name. He sat down at the table without saying anything. But he sat down at the table. He had been eating upstairs 3 mornings out of 5 before this week. Evelyn set a bowl in front of him and went back to the stove and did not remark on it. The letter from Mrs. Aldrich came on a Saturday. Evelyn learned about it only because she was in the kitchen when Caleb came in with the mail from the box at the end of the drive, and she saw his jaw set slightly when he read it, which was the kind of signal that preceded nothing good. "Problem?" she asked. He set the letter on the table. It was from a woman in town, a widow who had apparently positioned herself as a voice of community standards, which was a role that existed in every small town Evelyn had ever encountered, always occupied by someone who confused social gatekeeping with moral authority. Mrs. Aldrich had written to inform Caleb that she and several other women of Blackridge were concerned about the propriety of his situation. A man of standing, she wrote, keeping an unmarried woman in his home, in a circumstance that was neither marriage nor domestic service in any recognized form, and that this arrangement raised questions about the example being set for his children. Caleb read it once and set it down. "I should have expected something like this," he said. "You probably should have," Evelyn agreed. She looked at the letter without touching it. "What do you want to do about it?" "Nothing," he said. "It's none of her business." "That's true," she said, "and it won't stop her from making it her business." She looked at him. "Do you want my opinion?" "Yes." "Ignore it for now. Do not respond. If she raises it again or brings other people into it, then you can decide how to address it." She looked back at the letter. A response right now gives her something to respond to. Silence makes her responsible for the next move. He picked up the letter and looked at it again. "I don't like it," he said. "No one would." "It implies—" "I know what it implies," she said, "and you know it's not true. What other people think about it is a problem for later." She turned back to what she had been doing. "Unless it's become a problem for you, with your own thinking about the situation." The silence that followed lasted long enough to mean something. "No," he said finally, "it hasn't." She nodded and kept working. But the letter left something behind in the house, the way cold left behind a particular kind of damp after a frost. She felt it in the slightly different quality of Caleb's silence that evening. Not uncomfortable exactly, but more conscious, more aware of things. She recognized the awareness because she felt it herself, the awareness of two people who have been reminded by outside pressure that they are in the same room more than they might be if the circumstances were different. She was not unaware of Caleb Thornton. She would have been dishonest with herself to claim otherwise. He was a good man in a way that was not showy or performed, which was rarer than it should have been. He was honest to a degree that sometimes surprised her. He had a temper. She had seen it once, briefly, when a fence repair went wrong and took out a section he'd have to redo, and the words that came out of him in the pasture were not words she would repeat, but it was a temper that burned fast and cooled fast, without the low residual heat that was the kind she really watched out for. She was not looking for anything from him. That was true. But she was also not blind. She managed this by focusing on what was in front of her, which was the work. and the children, and the daily small architecture of keeping a household functioning. It was enough. It had always been enough for her, this kind of dailiness. She had learned long ago that she was better suited to concrete action than to hoping, and that waiting for things to come to her was a poor strategy for a woman with her particular history. Noah's test, when it came in full, came on a Sunday. He had been watching her for almost a month by then. She knew he had been watching her the same way she had been watching him, carefully, from the side, assessing. He was a smart child, and smart children who were angry ran a particular kind of check on new people. They waited for the moment when those new people would show their real shape. She was in the main room darning a pair of Caleb's socks when Noah came and sat in the chair across from her. He sat with his arms crossed, feet on the floor, in the posture of someone who was about to make a point. "My mother used to sit there," he said. She looked up. "I know, Maggie told me." "Then why are you sitting there?" She looked at him directly, the same way she had looked at him on the day she arrived. "Because I live here, and it's a chair," she said. "And because I don't think your mother would want it left empty." He flinched. She had not expected him to flinch. She had expected argument. And the flinch told her she had touched something real rather than something performative. "You didn't know her," he said. "No," she said. "But I know she raised you, and that tells me something." He stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means she did something right." She went back to the sock. "I'm not here to replace her, Noah. I've told you that. I meant it." "Then why are you here?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Because your father needed help and I needed work," she said. "And because I think maybe this family needed someone who wasn't also grieving to come and hold some things steady for a while." She looked up again. "That's all. That's the whole of it." He was quiet. His arms uncrossed slowly, as if he hadn't noticed they had. "She used to do the darning on Sundays," he said. "A lot of women do," she said. "Light's better on Sundays. Quieter." He looked at his hands. He had his father's hands, large for his age, already showing the roughness of outdoor work. "She was better at it than you," he said. "Probably," Evelyn said. "She had more practice." Another long silence. The fire clicked. Outside, a wind moved through. "She smelled like lavender," he said. He said it like he hadn't meant to, like it came out ahead of the decision to say it. Evelyn set down the sock. She looked at him, and she did not look away, and she did not try to fill the space with comfort or consolation. She just let him have said it. "That sounds like a good thing to remember," she said finally. He stood up abruptly, the way people stood when they had said more than they intended. He went to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the darkening yard. She picked up the sock and went back to darning. After a while, he said very quietly, without turning around, "Is the cornbread from Tuesday gone?" "There's one piece left," she said, wrapped in the cloth on the second shelf. She heard him go to the kitchen. She heard him find it. She heard him go upstairs. She finished the sock and started on the second one, and the fire settled and the house breathed around her. And she thought that grief did not leave people. She had known that for a long time. But sometimes, given enough steadiness and enough patience and enough people willing to sit in the same room and keep working, it moved from the center of a person toward the edges, where it became something they could carry instead of something that carried them. She was not certain she could give Noah Thornton that. She was not certain anyone could, entirely. But she was here. She was in the chair. She was not leaving. Outside, the wind ran along the eaves and kept going, out into the dark open range, and the ranch sat still and solid under the enormous sky, holding its people the way. Worn things held the shapes of the hands that had used them, imperfectly, familiarly, with the specific warmth of something that had been lived in long enough to start to know you back. The piece of cornbread Noah had taken from the kitchen shelf on Sunday was gone by Monday morning, and he came down for breakfast without being called. It was a small thing. Evelyn did not remark on it. She set a bowl in front of him the same as she always did, and he ate, and Maggie watched him with the sideways attention of a sister who notices everything and has learned not to say so. And Caleb came in from the early chores and sat at the table, and the four of them ate breakfast together in a silence that was different from the silences that had come before it. Less held, less like something waiting to break. Afterward, Noah carried his bowl to the basin without being asked. He set it down, and he almost said something. She could see it in the way he paused at the kitchen doorway, the slight turn of his head, and then he went out to help his father, and the moment passed, and that was enough. December arrived the way it arrived on the plains, not gradually, but all at once, as if the sky had simply decided. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days. The first real snow came on a Tuesday, not a dusting, but a proper snowfall that changed the shape of everything, filling in the angles of the fence posts and the woodpile and the barn roof, making the ranch look briefly like a place in a painting, rather than a place where people worked and struggled and got up before dawn and went to bed bone-tired. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and looked at it while the coffee heated, and she let herself have 30 seconds of thinking it was beautiful. Then she went back to the practical questions. The water barrel would need breaking each morning. The path to the barn would need clearing. Maggie's coat had a seam splitting at the left shoulder that needed proper repair before the cold got worse. She had been at the Thornton Ranch for just over 5 weeks. In 5 weeks, she had reorganized the kitchen, salvaged the rosemary and 2 other things in the garden, repaired the curtain rod, cleared the tack room, established a routine that meant there was hot food 3 times a day, and the house was warm by the time the children came downstairs. She had written 6 letters, to the county seat, to the Women's Aid Organization in Abilene that she had contacted before leaving Philadelphia, to a seed supplier in Kansas City about spring pricing. She had not told Caleb about the letters yet. They were her own business for now. What she had not managed to do was make Noah trust her. He was warmer. That Sunday conversation had changed something. She could feel it. But warmer and trusting were not the same country. He still watched her with the careful assessment of someone waiting for a mistake. He still occasionally forgot tasks she had asked him to do, and she could not always tell whether it was genuine forgetting or a test. She held the line either way. She did not let things go, and she did not make them larger than they were. And she tried to do both of these things without letting him see that she was doing them on purpose. Caleb noticed. She was aware of this. He watched her with Noah the way a person watched someone diffuse something carefully, with a held-breath attention that was trying not to interfere. One evening he said, "You're patient with him." "I'm consistent," she said. "That's different from patient." He considered this. "What's the difference?" Patient means you're waiting for something to change. Consistent means you're going to be the same regardless. She folded the dishcloth. "He doesn't need me to wait for him. He needs me to still be here." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He stopped. "Where did you learn that?" "From being the person no one was consistent with," she said. She said it without self-pity, just as information, and she did not elaborate, and he did not push, and that was how they handled most things between them now. A certain amount of honest disclosure, and then back to the work. The trouble with Mrs. Aldrich came to a head on a Wednesday, 2 weeks into December. Evelyn was in town with Caleb for the weekly supply run when she turned a corner and found herself face-to-face with a cluster of 3 women outside the dry goods store. She recognized 2 of them from the stagecoach crowd, not by name, but by the specific quality of their attention when they looked at her, the kind of attention that had already decided something. The third was Mrs. Aldrich herself, whom Evelyn identified by process of elimination and by the way the other 2 women deferred to her. Mrs. Aldrich was a tall woman in her 60s with the upright posture of someone who had decided long ago that her carriage was a moral statement. She looked at Evelyn the way she had probably looked at everything that didn't fit her categories, steadily, without expression, as if assessment were a public service she was performing on behalf of everyone present. "Miss Carter," she said, so she knew the name. "Mrs. Aldrich," Evelyn said. So did she. The other 2 women looked between them with the bright-eyed attention of people who have turned up at something interesting. "I have been meaning to introduce myself," Mrs. Aldrich said. "I understand you've taken up residence at the Thornton property." "I'm managing the household," Evelyn said, "for wages." "I see." A pause that was doing a great deal of work. "And how are the children?" "Well," Evelyn said, "Maggie's shoulder seam needs mending, but her spirits are much improved. Noah is eating regularly and helping with chores." She said it pleasantly, as information, as if she had not noticed the weight behind the question. Mrs. Aldrich's expression shifted very slightly. She had expected either defensiveness or deference, and she had gotten neither. "I'm glad to hear the children are being looked after," she said, in a tone that implied she was reserving judgment on how they were being looked after. "Mr. Thornton is a well-regarded man in this community." "He is," Evelyn agreed. He's also a practical man. He knew what his household needed, and he arranged for it. She met Mrs. Aldrich's eyes steadily. Is there something I can help you with? Another pause. The two other women were very still. I simply wanted to put a face to the name, Mrs. Aldrich said finally. Blackridge is a small town. People know one another's business. So I've gathered, Evelyn said. If you'll excuse me, I have a list to get through before the afternoon. She went into the dry goods store. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heart was moving a little faster than usual, which she considered a reasonable tax on the situation and nothing more. Caleb was at the counter when she came in. He had heard. The store was not large. And he looked at her when she came to stand beside him with a question he didn't ask. Fine, she said, before he could. She wanted to look at me. She's looked. We can move on. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the counter. 2 pounds of coffee, he said to the man behind it. She added her own items to the order, and they loaded the wagon, and they drove back toward the ranch in the early afternoon light. And the subject of Mrs. Aldrich was set aside the way they set most things aside. Not ignored, but placed somewhere accessible for later. What neither of them said, on the way home, was what had actually happened in that brief exchange. That Evelyn had stood her ground in front of 3 women who expected her to fold, and had done it without cruelty and without apology. And that this was the kind of thing that did not go unnoticed in small towns, which operated on a system of small precedents accumulating into something larger. She would hear later from Ruth at the hotel, who seemed to have a particular gift for information, delivered casually, like weather reports, that Mrs. Aldrich had apparently said to the women with her after Evelyn went inside, "Well, she's not what I expected." Ruth told her this without comment. Evelyn filed it the same way. The fever began on a Thursday. Maggie had been quiet at breakfast, quieter than usual, which was saying something. And Evelyn had noticed but attributed it to the cold, which had its own way of flattening people's energy, and to the fact that Maggie sometimes had quiet days that had no particular cause. She had not pressed. She had kept an eye on her through the morning, the way she kept an eye on everything, the constant low-level monitoring that was simply the habit of someone responsible for a household. By midday, Maggie had not come out of her room. Evelyn went up. The child was in her bed with her quilt pulled to her chin and her face flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Evelyn put her hand on Maggie's forehead and felt what she had been half expecting to feel. Heat, real heat, not the warmth of a child who had been under blankets too long. "How long have you felt like this?" she asked. "Since breakfast," Maggie said. Her voice had the particular thickness of someone whose throat had started hurting. "I didn't want to say." "Why not?" A pause. "I didn't want you to worry." Evelyn looked at her. The child was 9 years old, and she had learned to manage the things she was feeling so as not to create additional weight for the people around her. And this was heartbreaking in the specific way that children's adaptive behaviors were heartbreaking. They were so effective, so competent, and so unnecessary. "You can tell me when you feel bad," Evelyn said. "That's not creating a problem. That's just telling the truth." Maggie looked at her with those large, careful eyes, and in them was the look of someone receiving information that contradicts a long-held conclusion. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Evelyn said. "I'm going to get some things. You stay here." She went downstairs and moved quickly and without panic, which was the only way to move in this kind of situation. She had seen fevers. She had managed fevers, her own and others, in circumstances with fewer resources than this. She knew what a fever that was going to pass looked like, and she knew what a fever that was going to become a problem looked like. And right now this was somewhere in between, which meant it required attention and not alarm. She brought water and a cloth and the tin of dried willow bark she had organized to the front of the medicine shelf when she reorganized the kitchen, because willow bark was what you had when you didn't have a doctor, and when the nearest town was an hour away, and when winter had made the roads slow. She brought a small pot and the means to make a thin broth, because broth was fluids, and fluids were the critical thing. She got Maggie to drink water. She got the cloth on her head. She made the broth on the small stove in the upstairs hallway, a detail of the house she had initially thought was odd but was now grateful for. And she fed it to Maggie in small amounts, patient, measured, watching the fever, the way you watched a fire that had gotten into something it shouldn't be in, not panicking, but not looking away. Caleb came in from the afternoon chores at 4 and found her upstairs. She heard him on the stairs and came to the doorway before he reached it. "She's sick," she said quietly, so Maggie wouldn't hear the conversation through the door. "Fever started this morning. I have it managed for now. She needs rest and fluids and watching through the night." He looked past her at the door. Something went across his face. A specific, rapid fear, the kind that came from memory rather than the present moment. And she recognized it because she had been watching for exactly this. "How bad?" "Bad," he said. Not a question, really. A man bracing. "Not critical yet. I want to watch it for the next several hours. If it goes higher, I'll need you to ride for the doctor." She kept her voice even and factual, because even was what he needed right now, not reassurance that might prove wrong. "Right now it's manageable." He put his hand on the doorframe. His jaw was set in the way she had seen it set when he was containing something. "Her mother," he said. "The fever came fast." "I know," she said. "I'm watching it." He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not offer him false comfort, because false comfort would have been a form of dismissal, and he was not a man who deserved to be dismissed. She let him see that she was serious, that she understood what this cost him to stand in this hallway and hear the word fever, and that she was not going to look away from any of it. "Let me in," he said. "In a minute. Let me get her settled first. Then you can sit with her, but don't let her see your face right now until you've got it under control." He flinched. "What does that mean?" "It means she'll read your fear and it'll scare her more than the fever does." She said it without softening it, because softening it would not have helped him. "Get some water, wash your face. Give me 5 minutes." He stood in the hallway for a moment, and she could see him working through it. The fear, the memory, the effort of getting his face into a shape that would not alarm his daughter. Then he turned and went back downstairs. She went in to Maggie. The night was long. Fevers had their own rhythm, and this one moved through its stages with a kind of terrible patience, falling slightly in the early evening, rising again after midnight, the point at which Evelyn sat at the edge of Maggie's bed and worked, methodically, through everything she knew. She changed the cooling cloths every 20 minutes. She got Maggie to drink water each time she stirred. Not large amounts, just sips, consistent and steady, because the body's most critical need in a fever was not medicine, but hydration, and hydration required patience. She tracked the fever by touch, by the child's breathing, by the color at her wrists and her lips. Caleb sat in the chair in the corner. He had gotten his face under control, as she had asked. I was present without being in the way, which was the best thing he could be, and she could feel the effort it cost him. The particular tension of a man who needed to be doing something and had understood that the right thing to do was to hold still. Around 2 in the morning, Maggie woke from a half-sleep and looked around the room with the disoriented expression of someone who doesn't know where they are, and her eyes found Evelyn first. "You're here," she said. "I'm here," Evelyn said. "You stayed." "I said I was going to watch you through the night." Maggie looked at her for a long moment, the fever flush bright on her cheeks, her eyes with the strange liquid clarity that high temperatures sometimes gave. "You're not going to leave, are you?" she said. It was not quite a question. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Not tonight," she said. "Let's start with tonight." It was honest, and Maggie seemed to understand the honesty of it, which was something. She closed her eyes. Evelyn put the cloth back on her forehead. In the corner, Caleb made a sound that was very quiet and entirely involuntary, the sound of someone who has been holding a great deal of tension and has had some of it move. Noah appeared in the doorway at 3. She had not heard him come down the hall. He was in his nightclothes, barefoot, hair flattened on one side, and he stood in the doorway looking at his sister with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face since she arrived. The defenses were down. He was just a 12-year-old boy looking at his sick sister, and underneath all the anger and the testing and the grief was simply this: a child who was afraid of losing another person. She got up quietly and went to the doorway. "She's all right," she said, low. "The fever's high, but I've seen worse. I'm managing it." He looked at her. His eyes were wet, though she did not think he knew it. "You don't know that," he said. "You can't know that." "No," she said. "I can't promise you an outcome. I can tell you that I know what I'm doing and that I haven't left her side and that I'm not going to." She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "What I need from you is to go back to bed and let me work." Can you do that? He looked past her at Maggie, at his father in the corner chair, at the arrangement of cloths and water, and the careful, methodical order that Evelyn had made of the sick room. What can I do? He said. It came out differently than his usual questions. Not a challenge, not a test. A real question. In the morning, when it's light, I may need you to ride for the doctor if things haven't improved. I'll need you rested for that. She paused. That's a real job. That matters. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went back down the hall to his room. She returned to Maggie's bedside. The fever broke just before dawn. It did not break dramatically. There was no single moment of obvious change. It was gradual, the way most real recoveries were, a degree at a time. The heat easing, Maggie's breathing slowing and deepening from the rapid, shallow rhythm of high fever to something that was closer to ordinary sleep. Evelyn tracked it carefully and did not allow herself to relax until she was certain. At 5:30 in the morning, she put her hand on Maggie's forehead and felt the difference. Real, measurable difference. The fever was still present. These things did not simply vanish. But it had broken its peak. The body was winning. She sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. Caleb had been asleep in the corner chair for 2 hours, having finally stopped fighting it somewhere around 3. She looked at him, the sharpness of his face gone loose in sleep, the exhaustion that had been in him all night visible now in the particular vulnerability of a person unconscious in a chair. He had trusted her enough to sleep, which was its own kind of statement. She got up quietly. She went downstairs and built up the kitchen fire and put on the coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the early gray light and looked out at the ranch in the cold pre-dawn, the shapes of the barn and the outbuildings dark against the snow, the sky beginning to lighten at its edges. She was tired in the deep way that came from sustained vigilance, the tiredness that lived in the bones rather than the muscles. She was also something else, something harder to name, something that felt like having stood exactly where you were supposed to stand in exactly the right moment and having done the thing that needed doing. She heard the stairs. Caleb came into the kitchen looking as rough as she had expected. The chair had not been kind to him, and the night's fear had worked on him visibly. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then he looked at the coffee pot. She broke it, Evelyn said. Just before 6. She's sleeping normally now. He stopped at the basin and put both hands on the edge of it and stood there for a moment with his head down, and she understood that this was a man who needed 30 seconds to let something out that he had been holding all night. And she turned back to the window and gave him those 30 seconds without comment. When she turned around, he had poured himself a cup of coffee and was standing at the table, and he looked steadier. Not because anything in him had changed, but because he had been given the privacy to let it move through him rather than being watched while it did. "The doctor," he said. "I should still send for him." "Yes," she said. "Not urgent, but he should look at her today." She pulled her own cup toward her. "And she needs broth again when she wakes." "I'll make it." "You've been up all night," he said. "I can sleep when she's seen and settled." She drank her coffee. "I've done longer." He looked at her across the kitchen table, the same table they had sat at that first morning, with her list and his early start and every morning since. He looked at her with something that had more weight in it than what had come before. Not the recalibration that Hargrove had made in the street, with its downward adjustment and its casual cruelty. Something that went the other direction entirely. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You don't need to," she said. "Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her given name. Neither of them remarked on it, but it was there, in the kitchen, along with the coffee and the early light and the tiredness and the relief. "I mean it. Last night—" He stopped. He set down his cup. "When I heard the word fever, I know," she said. "I saw. And you didn't try to tell me it was going to be fine." "I didn't know that it was." "No," he said. "But you knew what to do." She looked at him. "I knew some of what to do," she said. "There's a difference." She was not being falsely modest. She was being precise, because precision was what she trusted. She needed steady attention and the right things in the right order, and I could give her that. Anything beyond that would have required the doctor. She held his gaze. "I didn't save her from something terrible. I just kept it from becoming terrible. That's a smaller thing." It's not a smaller thing, he said. Not to me. She did not answer that. She looked at her coffee cup. Noah came down at 7, fully dressed, boots on, ready to ride. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them and then said, "Maggie?" "Better," Evelyn said. "Fever broke. She's sleeping." He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding since he woke up. He sat down at the table and put his elbows on it and his face in his hands for a moment. A gesture so unguarded and so young that it made her chest hurt in the specific way that children's unguarded moments did. Then he straightened up. He looked at Evelyn. "You were up all night," he said. "Yes?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he looked up at her and said, "Thank you." He said it plainly, without decoration, without it costing him as much as she might have expected. She nodded. "Go see her when she wakes up. She'll want to see you." He nodded back. The doctor came at midday, a practical, weathered man named Fielding who had been doctoring on the plains long enough to have lost any illusions about frontier medicine. He examined Maggie, asked Evelyn a series of direct questions about the timeline of the fever and the treatment, and listened to the answers with the attention of a man who was assessing competence rather than filling in a form. When he came downstairs, he said to Caleb, "The fever's down and she's stable. Another day of rest and broth. Keep her warm. Watch for any return." He paused. "Whoever managed her last night managed it well. Another few hours of that heat without the right care." He stopped, as doctors did when they were declining to finish a sentence. "She'll be fine." He looked at Evelyn when he said it, not at Caleb. After he left, Caleb went back upstairs to sit with Maggie. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen and started the broth, and she stood at the stove and stirred it and let the tiredness wash over her now that the crisis was done. And she thought about what Dr. Fielding had not finished saying, and about the parallel that Caleb had been living with all night. His wife, another fever, the 4 days, the end of it. And she thought that some fears did not leave you. They only waited to be either confirmed or disproved, and that to live alongside a fear like that required a particular kind of courage that did not get talked about enough because it was quiet and daily and looked like ordinary life from the outside. She was nearly finished with the broth when she heard the stairs again, and then Maggie's voice from above, thin but real, asking for water. And then Noah's voice answering her, and then what she thought might have been a short laugh. The specific, unrepeatable sound of a child who has been very frightened and is now very relieved and has no better way to express it. She stood at the stove and listened to the sounds of the house coming back to itself, and she did not move for a moment, just stood there in the kitchen with the broth simmering and the fire going and the light coming through the window at its low December angle, and she let herself feel the full weight of the night and the full relief of the morning, and she did not try to make it into anything other than what it was. She had stayed. The fever had broken. The child was going to be all right. Outside, the snow that had fallen lay still and undisturbed on everything, and the ranch sat in the white December quiet, and somewhere in the distance a hawk moved against the pale sky, solitary and purposeful, riding the cold air toward whatever it was looking for. Maggie recovered slowly, the way children recovered from things that had genuinely frightened them. Not just the body healing, but the whole self reassembling, piece by piece, back into its ordinary shape. She spent 2 days in bed after the fever broke, which she accepted with less resistance than Evelyn expected. On the 3rd day, she came downstairs on her own, still pale, still moving carefully, and sat at the kitchen table and watched Evelyn work with the particular attention of someone who has recently had cause to pay close attention to a person and has not stopped. "You didn't sleep," Maggie said. "I slept after the doctor came." "You slept sitting up in the chair," Maggie said. "I saw you before the doctor." She pulled the quilt she'd brought downstairs tighter around her shoulders. "Your neck must have hurt." "My neck survived," Evelyn said. Maggie was quiet for a moment. She had a cup of broth in front of her that she was working through slowly, both hands around it for warmth. "Miss Carter," she said. Why did you stay up all night?" Evelyn turned from the stove and looked at her. "Because you were sick, and someone needed to watch you." "But you could have woken Pa." "Your father was watching you too, and he needed a few hours of sleep because he has cattle to manage, and a ranch that doesn't stop for sickness." Maggie considered this. She drank some broth. "Ma used to say that was the hardest thing about the ranch," she said. "That the work didn't stop. Even when she was tired, even when she was... She stopped. Even when she was sick herself? Evelyn said. Maggie nodded. She never said it as a complaint, she added quickly, as if defending her mother from a criticism that had not been made. She just said it as a fact. It is a fact, Evelyn said. The work doesn't stop. That's not a good or bad thing. It's just what this life is. She turned back to the stove. Your mother understood the ranch. You can hear it in the things you say about her. Maggie was quiet again. This was the most either of them had talked about her mother directly, and Evelyn could feel the delicacy of it. The way the subject sat between them like something that needed to be handled with both hands. Do you think about her? Maggie asked. And then, quickly, you didn't know her. That was a stupid question. It wasn't stupid, Evelyn said. I think about what she built here, because I work in it every day. The kitchen she organized, the garden she planted, the children she raised. She paused. You can think about someone you didn't know. You just think about the evidence of them. Maggie looked up. Something in her face was doing what it sometimes did when Evelyn said something that landed differently than expected. A small, almost invisible rearrangement, like a picture being straightened on a wall. The evidence of them, she repeated. The rosemary, Evelyn said. The beans on the right side of the shelf, the way you hold a spoon. She came and set a fresh piece of bread beside Maggie's bowl. She's still here, just in a different form. Maggie looked at the bread. She looked at the broth. Then she looked at Evelyn with those wide, dark eyes that had been careful for so long and said, very quietly, I'm glad you stayed. Evelyn did not make a production of it. Eat your bread, she said. But she was aware, walking back to the stove, that something had settled in the house, something that had been slightly off balance since she arrived, and was now, incrementally, finding its level. Noah's change came differently, the way most things with Noah came differently. Sideways, without announcement, in a form you didn't immediately recognize as change. A week after the fever, Evelyn was in the main room in the evening, doing the mending she'd been putting off. The light was better in the main room than in the kitchen after dark, and she had claimed the chair by the lamp without asking permission, the way she had begun claiming small spaces in the house. Not aggressively, just steadily, the way water finds the shape of a vessel over time. Noah came downstairs, saw her there, and almost went back up. She could see the calculation on his face, the familiar debate between retreat and something else. Then he came and sat on the low bench near the fire, and he had something in his hands. A piece of wood, roughly shaped, and a small knife. He didn't say anything. He just sat and started working the wood with the knife. The careful, focused movements of someone who had been doing this long enough to have a method. She kept mending. After maybe 10 minutes, he said without looking up, It's going to be a horse. She looked at the piece of wood. It did not yet look like a horse. It looked like a possibility. How long does it take? She asked. Depends. A small one, maybe 4 or 5 evenings. He turned it in his hands. Pa taught me. He said his grandfather carved. Do you have any finished ones? A pause. A few. He glanced at her sideways. In my room. I'd like to see them sometime, she said, if you want to show me. He didn't answer right away. He went back to the wood. She went back to the mending. Outside, the wind moved around the house in its usual December way, finding every gap, testing every seam. The one on Maggie's windowsill, he said finally. I made that one for her birthday, 2 years ago. She remembered it, a small horse, maybe 3 inches long, with a flowing mane that was actually a series of very fine cuts in the wood, each one placed with precision. She had noticed it when she made Maggie's bed and thought it was lovely without knowing who had made it. That's an exceptional piece of work for a 10-year-old, she said. He looked at her to check if she meant it. She kept her eyes on the mending, which apparently satisfied him that it was not a performance. Pa said so too, he said. A pause. He doesn't say things like that unless he means them. No, she agreed. He doesn't. Another silence. The fire moved. The wind found a loose board somewhere and worried at it briefly, then moved on. Miss Carter, Noah said. Yes. When Maggie was sick. He stopped. He set the knife down on his knee and looked at the fire. When she had the fever, I heard you in there, the middle of the night. I could hear you moving around, changing the cloths and talking to her when she woke up. He was still looking at the fire. You talked to her like she was going to be fine. Even when he stopped again. Even when you weren't sure she was, Evelyn finished. Were you scared? He asked. He said it without looking at her, which was how he asked the questions that actually mattered. She thought about this honestly. Yes, she said. Fevers can go either way. I knew that. She folded the section of mending she'd finished and started on the next. Being scared and knowing what to do aren't mutually exclusive. You can be both at once. He was quiet. Then, I didn't know what to do. You asked, she said. That night, in the doorway. You asked what you could do. That's not nothing. But you sent me back to bed. Because that was the right answer at that moment. At 3 a.m, the right thing was for you to sleep so you could ride for the doctor if I needed you to. That was a real job. He finally looked at her. You meant that? It wasn't just something to say to get me out of the way? I don't say things to get people out of the way, she said. I say what I mean and mean what I say. You should know that about me by now. He held her gaze for a moment. I was 12, and the look on his face was the look of someone much older, someone who has had to grow his assessment skills faster than they were supposed to grow. Then he picked up his knife and went back to the wood. Okay, he said. It was the most important conversation she had with him, and neither of them marked it as such. They simply went back to what they had been doing, and the fire kept going, and the house settled around them. January came in hard, the way January did on the plains, with a cold that was different in quality from December's cold, drier, more absolute, the kind that made the air feel like something solid you were moving through. Caleb worked the cattle through it with the grim competence of a man who had done this before and had no illusions about what it cost. He came in at the end of those days with a specific tiredness that was not just physical, the tiredness of sustained exposure to conditions that required constant alertness and gave nothing back. Evelyn started leaving a pot of something hot on the back of the stove each evening, available whenever he came in. Not dinner. Dinner was at 6, same as always, but something extra. A broth, a soup, a thing that could be eaten standing up in a cold coat if the evening had run long and dinner was past, and he was too tired to sit. She did this without announcing it and without making it a gesture. It was just a practical response to a practical reality. He noticed. He didn't comment on it for 2 weeks, and then one evening he came in late and found the pot there and stood at the stove with a bowl of it and said, "This is the 3rd week you've done this." "Yes," she said. She was at the table with her letters. "You don't have to." "I know." He stood at the stove and ate the soup and didn't say anything else for a while. Then, "What are you writing?" She looked up. She had been waiting for this question in the background since December. "Letters," she said. "I've been corresponding with a seed supplier in Kansas City about spring planting, and with a woman's organization in Abilene that maintains a registry of available household positions in case—" She paused. "In case the situation here changed and I needed to find other work." He went still. "I'm not planning to leave," she said, before the stillness became something else. "I'm being practical. A woman in my position should always know what her options are. That's not the same as intending to use them." He looked at her across the kitchen. The lamp was between them, and in its light the lines of his face were more pronounced. The angular jaw, the directness of his eyes, the tiredness that January had put in him. "And if the situation didn't change," he said, "if it stayed as it is?" She held his gaze. "Then I'd keep writing the seed supplier and stop writing the woman in Abilene." A pause. "I'd like it to stay," he said. "As it is, or—" He stopped. He set the bowl down. "That's not quite what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. "I'm not sure you do." "Caleb." She had started using his given name the way he had started using hers, gradually, without announcement, until it was simply what they did. "You're tired and it's late, and I think this is a conversation that should happen when you've had some sleep." He looked at her for a long moment. He was clearly debating whether to press the point now or let it be, and she could see the two impulses in him, the directness that was his natural character, fighting against the caution of a man who had already had one important thing taken from him and was not casual about risking another. He let it be. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs and then sat for a while at the table with her letters and the lamp, and she thought about what he had almost said and what she had understood him to mean, and what she herself actually wanted, which was a question she had been not quite asking herself for some weeks. She was 43 years old. She had come here looking for practical necessity and had found, without planning to, something she had not expected to find again. She was not ready to name it yet, but she was not going to pretend it wasn't there. The visit from Hargrove came on a Saturday in late January, and it was the kind of event that was small in actual duration and large in what it revealed about everyone involved. Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard. Caleb was out by the barn. Through the window she saw who it was. The broad-shouldered shape, the particular way Hargrove sat a horse, like a man who wanted people to notice he was on one. She dried her hands and stayed in the kitchen. She heard the voices in the yard, Caleb's and then Hargrove's, too far away to make out words. She heard the register change. Then she heard boots on the porch, and the door opened, and Caleb came in first and Hargrove followed, and Caleb's expression was the particular expression of a man allowing something he wasn't sure he wanted to allow. Hargrove looked around the kitchen. He looked at the order of it, the clean shelves, the pot on the stove, the braided rug that Evelyn had made from old fabric 2 weeks ago because the floor was cold and the children's feet needed something between them and the boards. He looked at all of this, and then he looked at Evelyn. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which was more than she had expected. He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture Betts had made in the street that day, she noticed, the hat working that men did when they needed something to do with their hands, because the rest of them was uncertain. "I came to speak to Caleb about the spring water rights," he said. A plausible reason to be here. She suspected it was real, and also that it was not the only reason. "I'll let you talk," she said, and moved toward the other room. "Actually," Hargrove said. She stopped. If you have a moment, I wanted to say something." She turned around. She looked at him. He cleared his throat. "What happened when you arrived in Blackridge?" he said. He was looking at a point somewhere between her and the window. "The way that went, it was poorly done." She waited. He stopped. "I had reasons. They weren't good reasons. I understand that now." He glanced up at her and back down. "I wanted to say that." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it had cost him to come here and say this. Not much, probably, for a man like Hargrove, because men like Hargrove generally found apology easier than change. But something. Some fragment of something. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. "It's done." Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, and underneath it a more complicated thing. The particular expression of a man who has seen what someone became after he dismissed them and is recalculating the cost of that dismissal. "If there's ever—" he started. "Mr. Hargrove," she said pleasantly, the same pleasantness she had used with Mrs. Aldrich. "I think we're settled, don't you?" He looked at her. He heard what was in the pleasantness. "Yes," he said. "I expect we are." She went to the main room and sat down with the mending she'd been doing the night before. In the kitchen, she heard Caleb and Hargrove talking about water rights, the specifics of who held what, the spring allocation, practical things. The conversation went on for perhaps 20 minutes, and then Hargrove's horse left the yard. Caleb came to the doorway of the main room. He stood there looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something more serious. "You handled that," he said. "He apologized," she said. "I accepted it and closed it. That's all. He came here for more than water rights." "I know," she said. "He saw what I made of myself here, and he wanted to reopen something, to see if there was a door left." She kept her eyes on the mending. "There isn't." "No," Caleb said. "There isn't." She glanced up at him. The something more serious was more prominent now. "We're not done with that conversation," she said. "The one from last night." "No," he said. "We're not." "Later," she said, "when you're not standing in a doorway and I'm not doing mending." He almost smiled. The full thing, this time, not quite suppressed. "All right," he said. He went back to the barn. February arrived, and with it a particular quality of waiting, the waiting that came in late winter when the worst of the cold was still present, but the days were getting marginally longer, and you could feel, at the edge of things, the faint suggestion of what was coming. Evelyn started her seed orders. She spent 2 evenings making proper lists. What the kitchen garden needed, what the soil around here could support, what she remembered from her mother's garden in Pennsylvania, and what she'd had to learn to adapt. She wrote back to the seed supplier in Kansas City with a detailed order and a question about timing for this latitude. She showed the order to Caleb one evening. He looked at it for a while without speaking. "This is a lot of work," he said. "Yes," she said. "For a spring garden." "Yes." He looked up from the paper. "People who are thinking about leaving don't order seeds," he said. "No," she said, "they don't." He set the paper down carefully on the table between them. "Then I'd like to say something," he said, "and I'd like you to hear it before you decide what to do with it." She waited. "When I hired you," he said, "I told myself I was solving a problem, the household, the children, a practical arrangement." He looked at the seed order, then at her. "That stopped being true somewhere around the second week, and I've been honest with myself about it for a while now, but I haven't been honest with you, and that's—" He stopped. "That's not who I want to be." She was very still. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere to go," he said. "You have places you could go. You've made that clear. I want you to stay because you want to be here, because this is somewhere you choose." He held her gaze. "And if that's not what this is for you, I need to know that, and I'll adjust my thinking, and it won't change anything about the work or the house or how you're treated here." She looked at him across the table in the February lamplight, this angular, direct, tired, honest man who had written her a letter from across a gap of humiliation and offered her something real, and she thought about all the things that had brought her to this particular kitchen. The factory accident, the narrow room in Philadelphia, the 3 men in the street, the wagon ride through the opening range, the small room with the iron bed. And she thought that she had not expected any of this, had not planned for it, had specifically tried not to want it, because wanting things had a long history of costing her. "I know what it is for me," she said. "I've known for a while." He waited. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I want that on the record before anything else. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I don't surrender them easily, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I won't apologize for any of those things." "I know," he said. "You think you know," she said, "but I mean it more than you're probably imagining." "Evelyn," he said, "I've watched you go through a town that humiliated you, a woman who tried to make you feel unwelcome, a man who came here thinking he could reopen a door you'd already closed, and a night that could have broken most people. And I have not once seen you compromise who you are to make any of it easier." He paused. "I don't want you to be easy to live with. I want you to be you." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Maggie's face saying, "I'm glad you stayed," and Noah's voice saying thank you without it costing him what she'd expected, and the rosemary plant that everyone thought was dead, and the iron bed in the small room that had felt, from the first night, more like hers than any room she'd been in for years. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "All right," she said again, "but I want it done properly. I'm not going to simply shift from one arrangement to another without it being clear what we're doing and why." "What does properly look like?" "A conversation, not a conclusion," she said. "We have things to discuss. What this means for the children, what it means for the household, what we both expect." She pulled the seed order back toward her side of the table. "The spring garden isn't going anywhere. We have time to do this right." He looked at her across the table with an expression she had seen only once before, the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been given a safe place to set it down. "We have time," he said. Noah found out the way Noah found most things, not from being told, but from paying attention. He came into the kitchen a week later and found Evelyn and his father at the table after the children were supposed to be in bed, not doing anything remarkable, just talking, over coffee, in the low voices of people who were accustomed to each other's presence. And he stood in the doorway long enough for them both to see him, and then he went back upstairs. In the morning he came down for breakfast and sat at the table and said, without looking at either of them, "Are you going to stay? For good, I mean." Evelyn looked at him. "Yes," she said, "if that's all right with you." He was quiet for a moment. He moved his spoon around his bowl. "Maggie will be happy," he said. "And you?" Evelyn said. Another pause. He glanced at his father, then back at his bowl. "I think Ma would have liked you," he said, He said it as if he had decided something, as if this was a conclusion he had reached through careful work and had now delivered. She didn't have patience for people who pretended to be something they weren't. It was the highest compliment he had to offer. Evelyn understood this completely. "Thank you," she said. He ate his porridge. Maggie came downstairs and looked between all three of them and sensed the specific quality of what was in the room, and her face did the thing it sometimes did. The careful opening, the hope being allowed a little closer to the surface. "What?" she said. "Eat your breakfast," Noah said. "I'll tell you later." Maggie sat down and ate her breakfast with the focused energy of someone who has been told good news is coming and intends to eat as efficiently as possible to get to it faster. Caleb met Evelyn's eyes over the children's heads, and the look between them was brief and unspectacular and contained, in its ordinariness, everything that needed to be said. Outside, February's gray light was coming through the kitchen window at its low angle, and the ranch was waking up to its daily requirements, and the kettle was beginning to steam on the stove, and the house was making the sounds a house made when the people in it were all present and accounted for. Mrs. Aldrich sent a note in late February. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and then handed it to Caleb without comment. He read it. His eyebrows rose slightly. "She's inviting you to the Ladies' Aid meeting," he said. "I can see that," Evelyn said. He set it down. "Will you go?" She thought about it. She thought about the woman in the street, the tall posture, the steady assessing gaze, the 6 different things in the tone when she said, "I see." She thought about "she's not what I expected," delivered to 2 women on a sidewalk, which had traveled to her through Ruth, who had the particular gift for information that small towns required someone to have. "Yes," she said. "I think I will." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because she's the kind of woman who changes her mind slowly and publicly," Evelyn said. "And a town like Blackridge has a long memory. If she's decided to change her mind about me, it's worth being present for it." He considered this. "That's a particular way to look at it." "It's the accurate one," she said, the same words she had used on the wagon ride back from town in November. And he recognized them, and the corner of his mouth did what it sometimes did, the thing that thought about becoming a smile, and this time, quietly, did. The Ladies' Aid meeting was held on the first Thursday of March in the back room of the Blackridge Church Hall, which smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the particular staleness of a room that was used once a week and aired out insufficiently between uses. Evelyn arrived 5 minutes early, which was her habit, and found 3 women already there arranging chairs and a table of refreshments, with the efficient movements of people who had done this many times. Mrs. Aldrich arrived at exactly the appointed hour, which was also her habit, Evelyn suspected. She came in, took in the room, and her eyes found Evelyn without appearing to search for her. She crossed to where Evelyn was standing and offered her hand. "Miss Carter," she said. "I'm glad you came." "Thank you for the invitation," Evelyn said. She shook the hand. It was a firm handshake, which she respected. There were 11 women at the meeting in total. Evelyn knew 2 of them by sight, Ruth from the hotel, who arrived midway through and gave Evelyn a small nod that communicated approximately 4 things simultaneously, and a woman named Clara Marsh, who was Del Marsh's wife, and who looked at Evelyn with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had heard a great deal and wanted to form her own opinion. The rest were strangers, and they observed her with varying degrees of subtlety, and she let them observe and did not perform anything for their benefit. The meeting covered practical matters: a collection for a family whose barn had burned in January, the scheduling of a social for April, a discussion about the schoolteacher's contract, which was apparently a recurring source of disagreement. Evelyn listened and spoke when she had something relevant to say, which was twice. She did not try to establish herself. She did not try to be liked. She simply was there, present and attentive, the same way she was present and attentive in the Thornton kitchen every morning. Afterward, Clara Marsh came to stand beside her while the other women gathered coats and talked in small clusters. "You're not what I expected," Clara said. She said it the same way Mrs. Aldrich apparently had, though her tone had less architecture in it, just plain observation. "What did you expect?" Evelyn asked. Clara considered this honestly. "Someone more defeated," she said, "after what happened at the stage, and then going out to Thornton's place in those circumstances." She looked at Evelyn with direct brown eyes. Most women would have gone back east. I thought about it, Evelyn said. But you didn't. No. Clara tilted her head slightly. Why not? Evelyn thought about how to answer this, and she decided on the true answer rather than a tidier one. Because going back meant going back to a life that had already told me everything it was going to be, she said. And I wasn't done yet. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I'd like to call on you sometime, if that's agreeable. It's agreeable, Evelyn said. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, in the early March cold, with the sky beginning to show the first pale ambivalence about winter, not quite ready to release it, but no longer fully committed, she thought about what Clara had said. Most women would have gone back east. She had said it as a compliment, but underneath it was the same thing that had been underneath almost every assessment of her since she arrived in Blackridge. The assumption that survival was exceptional, that continuing was extraordinary. She had never thought of it that way. She had thought of it as the only available option, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was not something she had ever quite been able to do. Not after the factory. Not after the years of narrowing, not in the street in Blackridge with her suitcase and the whole town watching. She had not continued because she was brave. She had continued because she was built in a particular way that did not easily accommodate stopping, and for most of her life she had not been sure whether this was a strength or simply a stubbornness that had not yet encountered the thing large enough to break it. She was less uncertain about that now. Spring came to the Thornton Ranch. The way it came to that part of the plains, not gently, not dramatically, but with a kind of grinding insistence, the cold retreating inch by inch while the land pushed back, stubborn and patient. Until one morning you looked out and something in the light was different, and the ground had a quality it hadn't had the day before, and you understood that the season had changed, not overnight, but over weeks, and this particular morning was simply the one where you finally noticed. Evelyn noticed it on a Wednesday. She was in the kitchen garden, working the soil with the hand fork she had found in the barn and sharpened on the whetstone she'd located in the tack room, and the earth was yielding in a way it hadn't been. Dark, workable, with the particular smell of ground that had been covered by snow for months and was now fully open to whatever came next. Maggie was beside her, as she usually was on weekend mornings and increasingly on weekday afternoons when school let out early. She had grown, Evelyn noticed, over the winter, not visibly from day to day, but in the aggregate, so that the girl who had stood on the porch watching her that first day in her mended dress had become something slightly more substantial, slightly more certain of her own edges. The squash goes in the middle row, Maggie said. She was working her own section of the garden with the focused seriousness she brought to everything she had decided mattered. I remember, Evelyn said. Ma said it needed the most sun. She patted the soil she'd turned. Do you think she'd like how the garden looks? Evelyn looked at the garden. It was not beautiful yet. Gardens in early spring never were, just brown and potential, the hope of things rather than the things themselves. But the structure was there, the rows defined, the soil prepared, the rosemary plant trimmed back to its healthy wood, and already showing the faintest new growth at its tips. I think she'd recognize it, Evelyn said. I think she'd see the bones of what she built. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Is that good? That's very good, Evelyn said. That means it held. Maggie thought about this while she worked. Then she said, in the particular voice she used for things she had been considering for a while, and was only now saying out loud, When you and Pa get married, what should I call you? Evelyn stopped working. She looked at Maggie. Maggie, I know it's not decided yet, Maggie said quickly, practically, with the tone of someone who has thought through the logistics of a situation and wants to be prepared. But it will be, I can tell. She glanced up. I've been thinking about it since February. Evelyn looked at this 9-year-old girl with her practical intelligence and her carefully managed hope and the dark eyes that had learned, over a very hard year, to stay a little back from things before committing to them. She looked at her and felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not quite love, because love had different weights for different people, but something in that territory, something that had grown the way things grew in soil, you tended consistently, without drama, day after day. What do you want to call me? She asked. Maggie considered this seriously. Not Ma, she said. That's Ma's. She looked at the rosemary plant, but something that means something, Then we'll figure that out together, Evelyn said. When the time comes. Maggie nodded, satisfied with this. She went back to her section of the garden. Evelyn went back to hers, and she thought about the word together, how it had come out of her mouth without her thinking about it, and how it had been the exactly right word, and how the exactly right word was sometimes the one you didn't know you had until it was already said. The conversation with Caleb happened on a Saturday evening in late March, after the children were in bed, which had become the time when the two of them talked about things that required space. He had come in from the late barn check, and she had coffee on the stove, and they sat at the kitchen table the same way they had sat at it every morning for 4 months, but differently from all those mornings, with the particular quality of two people who have been moving toward something and have arrived. I've been thinking about what Maggie said, Evelyn told him. He looked at her. What did Maggie say? She asked what she should call me when we get married. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. She had built the fire up against the lingering March cold, and the lamp cast its steady light across the table, and outside the first frogs of the year had started in the low ground near the creek, tentative and intermittent, testing the season. When, he said. She said when. She did. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. She's a practical child, he said. She is, Evelyn agreed. She gets it from her father. He looked at her across the table with the directness that was simply his nature, unguarded, without performance. I want to ask you properly, he said. I'm aware that things have developed in a way that makes the asking feel somewhat after the fact, but I'd like to ask properly anyway. She waited. Evelyn Carter, he said. Will you marry me? Not because you have nowhere to go, not because the children need someone, not because the household needs managing. He held her gaze. Because I want you in this life, specifically, because you're the person I want across this table every morning for the rest of my mornings. It was not eloquent. He was not an eloquent man, but it was precise, and precision, she had learned long ago, was worth more than eloquence in the matters that actually counted. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding longer than just this conversation. She saw it leave him, the specific tension of a man who has been afraid of an answer and has been given the answer and is now, incrementally, reassembling himself around the relief of it. Yes, he said, as if confirming it. Don't make me say it a third time, she said. He did something then that she had not seen him do before. He laughed, a real one, not the almost smile she had catalogued over 4 months, but an actual laugh, brief and genuine. And it changed his face entirely, made it younger, made it show the man he had been before 14 months of grief had settled into his lines. She thought, there he is. They were married in the second week of April, in the office of the county judge in Black Ridge, with Ruth and Clara Marsh as witnesses, and Noah and Maggie standing beside them in their good clothes, Noah with his hair flattened determinedly, and Maggie with her braids done by Evelyn that morning, both sides even for the first time. It was not a long ceremony. The judge was a practical man who did not embellish. Evelyn wore her best dress, which was not fancy but was clean and well-fitted, and she stood beside Caleb in the judge's office and said what needed to be said and meant every word of it with the specific, unsentimentalized weight of a person who has arrived at a thing through difficulty and knows exactly what it cost. Afterward, Ruth embraced her with the brief, firm embrace of a woman who did not make productions of things. Clara's eyes were wet, which she acknowledged without embarrassment. Outside on the street, Maggie took Evelyn's hand. Not tentatively, not as a question. She simply took it, the way you took the hand of someone who was yours, and they walked together to the wagon, and that was that. Noah walked on Caleb's other side, and after a moment he said, without particular ceremony, I finished the horse. Caleb looked at him. Which one? The big one. The one I started in January. He glanced at Evelyn. I was going to give it to you, if you wanted it. I want it, she said. He nodded, satisfied, and climbed into the wagon. The spring planting happened in April and May. Evelyn worked the garden with the seed order from Kansas City, which arrived in 2 packages wrapped in brown paper, and she and Maggie planted each row with the careful attention of people who understood that what you put in the ground now was what you would have in August, and that carelessness in April was hunger in summer, and that the work was not romantic but was real and mattered. The squash went in the middle row. The rosemary, fully recovered now, grew in the corner where it had always been. On a morning in late May, Evelyn was in the garden when she heard the wagon on the road and looked up to see Del Marsh pulling in, which was not unusual. Del came by periodically, ostensibly on ranch business, actually as the primary mechanism by which information moved between the ranches north of Black Ridge. He climbed down and shook Caleb's hand by the barn and talked for 20 minutes, and then he came toward the garden and stopped at the edge of it. "Heard you got the South Acre turned over," he said to Evelyn. "Last week," she said. "Caleb said you were thinking of putting hay on it." "It's not getting used for anything else," she said. "And hay prices were high last fall. Worth trying." Del looked at her with the open assessment that was simply his manner, without malice. "You know hay," he said. "I know what pays," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden, at the turned South Acre visible beyond the fence line. "My wife wants to know if you'll come to dinner next week," he said. "She and you seem to have gotten on." "Tell her yes," Evelyn said. He nodded and went back to his horse, and she went back to her work, and she thought about what it meant that Del Marsh was standing at the edge of her garden asking her to dinner. This man who had said, "Lord knows that place has been running on nothing in the feed store in November," as if she were not standing there. People changed their assessments. That was the thing about assessments. They were not permanent. They were made in moments, with the information available in those moments, and when the information changed, the assessment could change with it. What you could not do was change an assessment by arguing with it. You changed it by giving people different information, and the only way to give people different information was to be different information, which meant showing up every day and doing the work, and letting time accumulate into evidence. She had understood this from the beginning, she thought. It was why she had not gone back to Philadelphia. It was why she had accepted Caleb's letter. It was why she had held steady with Noah and kept the line with Hargrove, and been present in the room when Mrs. Aldrich needed to see her. Because the only argument that mattered was the accumulated one. The one you made not in a single speech, but in 100 ordinary days. Summer came, and the hay on the South Acre came in better than either of them had expected, and Caleb sold it at the August market in Black Ridge, and came home and set the money on the kitchen table and looked at it, and then at Evelyn and said, "You were right about the acre." "I usually am about the things I'm confident in," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm learning." She looked at him. "How's it going, the learning?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "Slow," he said, "but I think I'm getting it." She picked up the money and put it in the household account she had established at the Black Ridge Bank in April, which had been a conversation with the bank manager that she chose not to repeat in detail to anyone, but the outcome of which was a joint account in both their names, which was not standard practice in Black Ridge, but was, she had made clear to the bank manager, the arrangement that was going to happen, and here was the documentation establishing its legality, and was there anything else he needed? The bank manager had found that he did not need anything else. Noah showed her the finished horse the evening of their wedding day, when they got back from town and the children had changed out of their good clothes and the ordinary rhythms of the ranch had resumed, which they did quickly, because ranches did not pause for ceremonies. He brought it down from his room and set it on the kitchen table in front of her without preamble. It was extraordinary. She had expected something good. She had seen his work on Maggie's birthday horse. But this was beyond that, the product of months of evenings by the fire. The wood worked down to something that had real life in it. The mane a series of cuts so fine and deliberate that they moved when you turned the piece in the light. She picked it up and held it and looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was the right response because it was not a piece that required words immediately. "You have a gift," she said finally. He was standing across the table with his arms at his sides, trying to look like he did not care what she thought. He cared enormously. "My grandfathers were better," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but you're 13. He had more years." She set the piece down carefully, upright, in the center of the table. "Where are you going to put it?" He blinked. "It's yours." "I know. I'm asking where you think it should go." He thought about it. He looked at the horse on the table. "The main room," he said. "On the shelf by the window. It'll catch the light in the morning." "Then that's where it goes," she said. He carried it there himself. She heard him in the main room, moving things on the shelf to make space, trying different positions the way you tried different positions with a thing you wanted to get right. The horse went on the shelf by the window. It caught the morning light the way he had said it would. On the last evening of August, almost exactly a year from the date she had answered 3 letters in her narrow room in Philadelphia and decided to try for something different, Evelyn sat on the porch of the Thornton Ranch in the cooling dark, watching the heat lightning move along the horizon over the range. No thunder, just the light, silent and distant, illuminating the edge of the sky in irregular intervals and then going dark again. Caleb came out and sat beside her. They had been married 4 months. The South Acre hay was in. The garden had produced more than she had planned for, and she was already thinking about expanding it next year. Noah had started his next carving, a buffalo this time, more ambitious, and had begun teaching Maggie the basic cuts, which she was learning with her characteristic serious attention. Clara Marsh had become what she supposed she would have to call a friend, which was a word she used sparingly and meant when she used it. Mrs. Aldrich had not become a friend, but she had become a known quantity, and a known quantity was manageable. The town of Blackridge had not transformed its opinion of her in any dramatic way. Towns did not do dramatic transformations. What it had done was shift, gradually, through the mechanisms by which small towns shifted, one assessment at a time, one dinner invitation, one morning at the Ladies' Aid, one conversation at the feed store, one day of watching someone do their work and do it well, and keep showing up to do it again. The woman who had stood in the street with her suitcase was not forgotten. People did not forget that kind of thing. But she had been overlaid the way things were overlaid when enough time and enough ordinary days accumulated on top of them. She thought about the woman in that street. 43 years old, rough hands, $11.40. The specific burn of being publicly assessed and discarded. She thought about her sitting in the hotel room doing the arithmetic of going back, and the 30 seconds she had given herself to feel it before she went downstairs to ask about work. She was glad she had not gone back. This was a simple thought and she did not dress it up. But she was also aware she had become more aware of this over the months of working and marrying and planting and watching the children find their way back towards something like ordinary, that the thing she had found here was not the thing she had come looking for. She had come looking for a husband and a practical arrangement and a way out of a narrowing life. What she had found was more specific than that, less like a solution and more like a place, less like a rescue and more like a recognition. Because the truth about starting over, the thing that nobody told you in the letters and the advertisements and the stories people told about frontier life and second chances, was that you did not start over. You did not get a clean page. You brought everything with you. The factory accident, the narrow room, the years of surviving without much help, the roughened hands, the habit of doing the arithmetic before you let yourself hope. You brought it all, and it came with you into the new life, and the new life had to be built around it, not instead of it. This was not a diminished thing. This was the real thing. This was what it actually looked like to begin again. Not an erasure of what came before, but a continuation of it. The same person making different choices in different circumstances, using everything the hard years had made of her. She had been made patient by difficulty. She had been made precise by loss. She had been made clear-eyed about people by years of being assessed and found wanting, which had given her the particular ability to look clearly in return, to see Caleb's honesty beneath his awkwardness, to see Noah's loyalty beneath his anger, to see Maggie's courage in the careful way she managed her hope. These were not things she had arrived with. They were things that had been built in her, the way the rosemary plant had been built, by cold and neglect and the long underground work of staying alive through conditions that did not especially want you to. She had not been wrong to keep going. She had not been wrong to stay. Caleb put his hand over hers on the arm of the porch chair. Not a gesture, just where his hand ended up. She did not move. The heat lightning ran along the horizon and lit the range for a moment. The fence lines, the barn roof, the shape of the land going out and out into the dark, and then went dark again, and the night settled back into its ordinary sounds, the frogs in the creek, the cattle shifting somewhere in the near pasture, the house behind them holding its quiet. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The South Acre," she said, "whether it'll support a second planting next year or whether the soil needs to rest." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that actually what you're thinking about?" She looked at the horizon. The lightning moved again, silent and remote. "I'm thinking that I almost went back," she said. "In that hotel room. I sat there, and I almost decided it." "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly. "Stubbornness," she said. And $11.40, which made going back less appealing than it sounds. She paused. And the fact that I hadn't found out yet what was going to happen. He turned to look at her. And now you know. Now I know, she said. The lightning ran one more time along the far edge of the sky, and in its brief light the land was there, enormous and indifferent and particular in hers. And then it was gone, and the dark came back, and she sat with her husband on the porch of the ranch where she had decided, one ordinary day after another, that she was going to stay. She had not been wanted by 3 men in a street. She had not been expected to amount to much by a town that had watched and waited and formed its early conclusions. She had not been what anyone pictured, and she had made something true and difficult and daily and hers out of all of it, not because she was exceptional, but because she had understood, the way you understood things that were not taught, but simply accumulated, year by year, through the work of living, that belonging was not given. It was not found. It was built, in the same way everything worth having was built, imperfectly, stubbornly, day after day, by hands that had learned to keep going. The frogs sang in the creek. The cattle settled in the pasture. Inside the house, in the main room, Noah's horse stood on the shelf by the window, waiting for the morning light.